Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Before we get started, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click that notification bell so you don't miss any future deep dives. Today we're going to be tackling UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So whether you're studying for the UPSC exams or just interested in international relations, this one's for you.
UNCLOS is basically the rule book for the oceans. It governs everything from fishing rights and shipping lanes to how we resolve maritime disputes.
And speaking of disputes, we'll be looking at a real-world example, the Enrique case. It involved a tense standoff between India and Italy over an incident at sea. But first, let's start with the basics.
Yeah.
What exactly is the UNCLOS?
Well, you can think of it as the Constitution for the Oceans. It's a huge treaty adopted in 1982 that replaced all those old conventions. It's really the foundation for modern maritime law.
Okay, so UNCLOS is the updated rulebook. But what makes it so powerful on the world stage?
It sets the stage for how nations interact at sea, everything from resource exploration to navigation rights. One of the most important parts is the EEZ, the Exclusive Economic Zone. It gives coastal nations exclusive economic rights within 200 nautical miles of their shores.
So it's like a country having a huge chunk of ocean where they have special rights to fish, drill for oil, and even harness renewable energy. That's a big deal, especially when those EEZs might overlap.
Exactly, and you see that happening right now with the disputes in the South China Sea. We'll get to that later. But UNCLOS didn't just define zones, it also created some important institutions to help manage ocean affairs and settle disputes.
Like maritime referees. Can you tell us more about those?
Sure. There are three main ones. First, there's the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, or ITLOS. It's like the Supreme Court, but for the oceans. And remember that Enrique case we mentioned, ITLOS played a key role there. Then we have the International Seabed Authority. They're responsible for managing resources on the seabed in areas beyond national jurisdiction.
So they're like guardians of the deep sea treasures, making sure things are explored responsibly.
Exactly. Then lastly, there's the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf. They help figure out where a country's continental shelf ends and the deep seabed begins. This is important because it defines the limits of a country's potential resource claims under the sea.
This is getting complex. But UNCLOS helps bring order to it all, right?
Right.
To understand how it works, let's take a look at the different maritime zones and what they actually mean.
Think of it like a map of the ocean. Each zone has its own set of rules. We start with the baseline, the low water line along the coast. From there, different zones extend outward, each with varying levels of control for coastal nations.
Okay, so let's take a virtual voyage through these zones. First up, internal waters. Are those literally inside a country?
They're like an extension of a country's land territory.
Yeah.
Waters on the landward side of the baseline, like bays, rivers, even lakes connected to the sea. The coastal state has complete control over these areas, just like on land.
So no foreign ships cruising through those waters without permission.
Exactly. No right of innocent passage there. It's strictly controlled by the coastal state.
So if we sail a bit further out, we reach the territorial sea. What's different about this zone?
The territorial sea extends 12 nautical miles from the baseline. The coastal state still has control, but there's a key difference, the right of innocent passage. So foreign ships can pass through as long as they don't pose any threat.
So they're allowed to pass through, but no funny business allowed. And just to clarify for our listeners, a nautical mile is a bit longer than a regular mile, right?
You got it. It's based on the Earth's circumference, roughly 1.15 land miles or 1.85 kilometers. Okay, moving outward, we hit the contiguous zone. This stretches from 12 to 24 nautical miles from the baseline.
Sounds like a buffer zone where the coastal state can keep an eye on things.
Yeah, you could say that. The coastal state doesn't have full control, but they can enforce certain laws there like customs, immigration, and sanitation regulation.
They want to protect their borders and interests even out at sea. Makes sense.
Right. It's about preventing anything that could affect the coastal state. Okay, the next zone is a major one, and it's where things get interesting, especially when we talk about disputes like the one in the South China Sea. This is the Exclusive Economic Zone, the EEZ.
The 200-mile zone with exclusive rights to resources. This must be a hot topic when countries have overlapping claims.
You bet. The EEZ is a crucial concept, and it's a big factor in many maritime disputes. But before we jump into those, what lies beyond the EEZ?
That would be the high seas, right? Is it like the Wild West out there?
In a way, the high seas are considered the common heritage of mankind. No single nation controls them. But that doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. UNCLOS still governs activities on the high seas, making sure they are peaceful.
So freedom, but with responsibility.
Exactly. And that sums up our tour of the maritime zones. Each one has its own rules and rights laid out in UNCLOS.
All this talk about zones and rights is interesting. but it can feel a bit abstract. To see how UNCLS works in the real world, let's look at a specific case that made headlines, the Enrique Alexei incident. It's a perfect example of how UNCLOS principles can lead to international disputes.
Yeah, that case with Italy and India really shows how jurisdiction and those maritime zones we just talked about come into play.
Okay, so let's rewind to February 2012. Two Italian Marines on an Italian oil tanker, the Enrique Alexei, opened fire on an Indian fishing boat, killing 2 fishermen. This happened in the contiguous zone off the coast of Kerala, India, about 20.5 nautical miles out. And that's where the jurisdiction questions began.
Was it Italy, since the Marines were on an Italian ship, or India because it happened near their coast?
Exactly. A legal battle started over whose laws applied and who had the right to prosecute the Marines.
Italy challenged India's arrest of the Marines, saying they didn't have jurisdiction. They pointed to Article 97 of UNCLOS, which deals with penal jurisdiction in the contiguous zone. They argued that India's rights in that zone were limited and didn't include murder.
So it became a battle over interpreting UNCLOS.
Exactly. The case went to the Indian Supreme Court, which initially ruled in India's favor. They said Indian law covered their entire 200-mile EEZ, but they clarified that only the federal government, not the state government, could handle it.
So a win for India at first.
Not so fast. Italy wasn't giving up. In 2015, they took the case to ITLOS, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, for arbitration under UNCLOS.
That went to the ocean court.
Exactly. ITLOS created a special tribunal, and in 2015, they ruled that both Italy and India had to suspend any prosecutions while arbitration happened. So the 2 Marines who were already back in Italy wouldn't face trial in India right away. The case went on for years. Then in 2019, the Permanent Court of Arbitration finally took over.
And what was the final decision in this back and forth?
The court decided that the Marines would be tried in Italy, not India, so India lost jurisdiction over the case.
Wow, the Enrique Alexei case shows how UNCLOS can be at the center of international disputes with big consequences for countries.
It definitely does, and it's not the only example. Now let's shift to another UNCLOS hotspot, the South China Sea. This region is a prime example of how overlapping claims and strategic interests can create problems.
The South China Sea is like a real-life case study in maritime law. It's surrounded by several countries, each with their own ideas about who owns what.
And the main issue is China's claim to a huge part of the South China Sea, based on what they call the 9-dash line.
That 9-dash line sounds controversial. What is it exactly?
It's a historical line that stretches way out from China's mainland, covering a massive part of the South China Sea. The problem is not everyone recognizes it. Vietnam, for example, strongly disagrees. They say they have their own historical proof of control over islands in the region going back centuries.
So we have clashing historical claims. And it's not just China and Vietnam, right? The Philippines, Malaysia, and Brunei also have claims in the mix. It's a tangle of competing interests.
It is, and applying UNCLOS in this region is a real challenge. The Philippines, for example, claims the Scarborough Shoal, which is closer to their shores than China's, but China insists it's theirs based on that 9-dash line.
So we have these competing claims with UNCLOS stuck in the middle. How does it apply to this situation?
UNCLOS provides the rules for defining those maritime zones we talked about, like the EEZ. But when those EZs overlap like they do in the South China Sea, things get complicated. UNCLOS doesn't specifically say how to handle that. It offers ways to settle disputes like arbitration, but it depends on countries negotiating and cooperating.
Which hasn't really happened in the South China Sea.
No, unfortunately, China has been assertive, building islands and sending their navy to control disputed areas. They're challenging the spirit of UNCLOS, which is all about peaceful solutions and respecting international law.
It's not just about territory either, right? The South China Sea is strategically and economically important.
It's very important. It's a major shipping route with trillions of dollars worth of goods passing through every year. Plus, it's rich in marine resources and could have tons of oil and gas. All this adds fuel to the fire.
So we have legal disputes, economic interests, and geopolitical rivalries. What does an organization like UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, have to say about the South China Sea?
UNCTAD has pointed out how strategically important the region is. They say a third of global shipping goes through the South China Sea. It's a critical route for international trade.
A third. That's huge. It really shows how interconnected the world is.
It does. UNCTAD has also talked about the environmental significance. They say it's rich in biodiversity and it's important for food security in Southeast Asia.
So it's not just about oil or shipping lanes. It's also about protecting the environment and the livelihoods of millions of people.
Exactly. That's why the South China Sea dispute is so complex. It's a legal issue, an environmental issue, an economic issue, and a security issue.
It shows how connected all these issues are. And UNCLS can't solve them all on its own.
You're right. It comes down to countries being willing to cooperate, negotiate, and find solutions that respect international law and everyone's interests.
So the South China Sea is a real test for UNCLOS. And speaking of tests, let's go back to the Enrique Alexei case and talk about ITLOS, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and their role in that dispute.
ITLOS is basically the court for UNCLOS. They settle disputes about how to interpret and apply the convention.
So when countries disagree about what UNCLOS means or how it applies to a specific situation, they go to ITLS for a ruling.
Exactly. Like Italy did in the Enrique Alexei case, they challenged India's jurisdiction, saying what the Marines did wasn't covered by India's rights in the contiguous zone.
So ITLS had to analyze those specific UNCLOS rules about jurisdiction, especially Article 97 about the contiguous zone.
Right? Article 97 gives coastal states some rights in the contiguous zone, but it's not unlimited. ITLOS had to figure out if killing those Indian fishermen was covered by Article 97.
And that was the big legal debate.
And their ruling said India didn't have jurisdiction to try the Marines. That decision had a big impact on relations between the two countries.
This case really shows how complex international law is and how hard it is to apply UNCLOS to specific situations.
It does. Even something like jurisdiction can be interpreted in different ways and lead to legal challenges.
And that's why having a neutral body like ITLOS is important. They can decide these disputes fairly.
Exactly. ITOS is key to upholding the rule of law at sea and making sure UNCLOS is implemented fairly.
Now let's think about UNCLOS in a bigger context. We've seen how it can both cause conflict, like in the South China Sea, and help resolve disputes, like in the Enrique Alexei case. It's a double-edged sword.
It is. It's both a way for countries to cooperate and a potential battleground. But it really comes down to whether countries are willing to act fairly and follow international law.
And as the world gets more interconnected and the oceans become even more important understanding, UNCLOS is crucial.
Absolutely. Whether you're prepping for the UPSC's Student International Relations or just someone who cares about the planet, UNCLOS is something you should learn about.
And that's what we've done today on the Deep Dive. We've talked about the main features of UNCLOS, from the maritime zones and institutions to real-world cases that show how complex it can be.
We've only scratched the surface, though. There's so much more to learn about this fascinating world of maritime law and governance.
Stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into UNCLOS.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time we explored those maritime zones and how UNCLOS works in real situations like the Enrique Alexei case and the South China Sea.
Yeah, it's interesting how UNCLOS tries to balance the interests of individual countries with the idea that the oceans are a shared resource. But with all the changes happening in the world, do you think there are parts of UNCLOS that might need updating?
Definitely, UNCLOS was created in a different time, and some new challenges have come up that it didn't really foresee.
Like, what are some examples?
Well, think about climate change. Rising sea levels could redraw coastlines and affect those maritime boundaries we talked about. That could lead to new disputes over resources and territory. And as it's written now, UNCLOS doesn't have clear answers for these climate-driven challenges.
So the rulebook was written before the game changed completely. The environment's a big factor. But what about resources? We talked about how the South China Sea is full of resources. Is resource scarcity putting more pressure on UNCLOS?
Yes, as the demand for fish minerals and other ocean resources keeps growing, there's more chance for conflict. UNCLOS might need to be looked at again to figure out how to manage and share these resources better, especially as technology improves and we can access resources in new ways like deep-sea mining.
Speaking of technology, that's another area where UNCLOS might need to adapt. Things like underwater data cables or even large-scale seaweed farming weren't even a thought a few decades ago.
You're right, UNCLOS might need to evolve to keep up with these innovations. And it's not just about adding new rules, but also making sure the current principles of the convention are followed in these new areas.
So even though the challenges change, those core principles of cooperation, peaceful dispute resolution, and sustainable use of the oceans are still key.
Exactly. And that's why understanding UNCLOS is so important, not just for legal experts, but for everyone who cares about the future of our planet.
Before we move on, let's talk about the International Maritime Organization, or IMO. They aren't directly created by UNCLOS, but they play a big role in how it's implemented, right?
For sure. The IMO is a UN agency that focuses on safety and security at sea and preventing pollution. Think of them like the traffic cops and environmental protectors of the oceans.
So all those huge cargo ships we see out there, we can thank the IMO for making sure they're not just floating hazards.
That's it. They set international standards for how ships are designed, built, and operated to make sure they're safe and don't harm the environment.
So they're the ones who turn those broad principles of UNCLOS into concrete actions.
Exactly. They work to prevent pollution from ships like oil spills, dumping garbage, or releasing harmful substances. And this all links back to UNCLOS because the convention provides that overall legal framework for protecting the marine environment and ensuring safe navigation.
It's a team effort. UNCLOS sets the goals, and organizations like the IMO help achieve them.
That's a good way to put it. And it's not just the IMO. There are others like the International Seabed Authority who manage resources in areas beyond national control.
What about the International Whaling Commission? What do?
They regulate whaling activities. They were actually established way before UNCLOS back in 1946. But the convention recognizes their role and brings it into that bigger system of ocean governance.
So even organizations that were around before UNCLOS have a place in the modern system of maritime law.
Yes, it shows that UNCLOS is designed to be flexible and adaptable. It incorporates those existing institutions and mechanisms.
So it's not just about making new rules, but also about harmonizing and coordinating the ones we already have.
Exactly. And that's a strength of UNCLOS. It takes a comprehensive approach to governing the oceans. It brings together different groups and tools to protect the marine environment and promote peaceful uses of the sea.
Let's bring this back to the real world and talk about something that's been in the news. The Philippines decided to start oil exploration again in their EZ, specifically in an area called Reed Bank, which is in the disputed South China Sea. Seems like a bold move considering the tension with China there.
It's a big development for sure. The Philippines is directly challenging China's claims in the region. It highlights those ongoing tensions over resource rights in the South China Sea that we talked about.
So it's like the Philippines is saying, we're going to use our rights under UNCLOS no matter what China thinks.
That's definitely the message. They're asserting their right to use those resources as UNCLOS allows them to.
But China also claims Reed Bank, right? This could escalate things.
You're right. China claims pretty much the entire South China Sea, including areas that are within the EZs of other countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia. They already reacted negatively, warning the Philippines not to go ahead with the exploration.
But it seems like the Philippines is ready to stand their ground.
They are. They say they are following UNCLOS and they won't back down because of China's pressure.
So this is becoming a real test between the Philippines and China, with UNCLOS in the background.
It is. This situation shows how UNCLOS can both empower smaller countries like the Philippines and cause friction with bigger, more powerful countries like China.
It also shows how the desire for resources like oil, gas, or fish can lead to maritime disputes. It makes you wonder if UCLS will need to change to handle these challenges as resources become more scarce.
That's a good point. We talked earlier about how UNCLOS might need an update to address things like climate change, resource scarcity, and new technologies. These weren't really big issues when UNCLOS was first created.
So where are some areas that might need updating?
Well, one thing is we might need clearer rules about how to deal with maritime boundaries that are changing because of rising sea levels. As coastlines change, so do the EZs, and that could cause new disputes.
That makes sense. And what about deep sea mining? We're pushing the limits of technology, and that could have big effects on the environment and resource management.
Absolutely. UNCLOS already governs seabed resources beyond national control. But as deep-sea mining technology gets better, the International Seabed Authority might need more power to make sure these activities are sustainable and don't damage those fragile deep-sea ecosystems.
So UNCLOS provides a starting point, but it might need some tweaks to keep up with the challenges of deep-sea mining. And what about those marine genetic resources we mentioned? The potential for new medicines and things like that is huge. But there are also questions about who owns those resources and how to share the benefits.
That's another area where UNCLOS might need to evolve. How do we balance the potential benefits with the need to protect marine biodiversity and make sure everyone has fair access?
So we might need to figure out who owns these resources, how to use them, and how to share the benefits, especially in areas beyond national control.
Exactly. These are tricky issues, and finding solutions that work for everyone will take careful negotiation and a commitment to sustainable development.
We've talked about a lot of areas where UNCLOS might need to change, but one of the biggest challenges with any international treaty is enforcement. How do we make sure UNCLOS is actually followed, not just written down?
That's the key question. It's one thing to have the rules, but it's another to make sure countries actually obey them.
So what are some ways to encourage compliance with UNCLOS?
One important tool is diplomacy and international pressure. When countries break the rules, other countries can speak up and urge them to comply. International organizations like the UN can also monitor compliance and help countries talk to each other.
So it's about making countries accountable for their actions.
Exactly. And there are also economic incentives. For example, countries that follow UNCLOS and manage their fisheries sustainably might get special access to certain fishing areas or markets.
So using both rewards and punishments to encourage good behavior, are there other things to consider?
In extreme cases, when diplomacy and economic incentives don't work, the international community might think about sanctions against countries that keep breaking the rules, things like trade restrictions or limits on getting international loans.
So there should be real consequences for breaking the rules.
Yeah,
But it sounds like sanctions should be a last resort only when things are really serious.
definitely. The goal is to encourage cooperation, not punishment. The best way to do that is to make sure all countries feel like they benefit from following the rules.
So the system needs to be fair and effective, balancing the interests of individual countries with the need to protect the oceans for everyone.
Exactly. And that's the challenge of international law in general, and UNCLOS specifically. Finding that balance between competing interests and creating a system that works for everyone now and in the future.
Now, before we wrap up this part, let's highlight some key takeaways for our listeners, especially those studying for the UPSC exams. UNCLOS is a big topic in international relations, so understanding it well is essential.
You're right, it's a key part of the GS2 syllabus, the international relations section.
So for our UPSC folks, what should they really focus on?
First, they need to really understand the basic structure of UNCLOS, the different maritime zones, the institutions it created, and the rights and responsibilities of countries under the convention.
So knowing those maritime zones inside and out is super important. Internal waters, territorial sea, contiguous zone, EEZ, high seas, they need to be familiar with all of them.
Absolutely. And they should also understand those three institutions we talked about, ITLOS, the International Seabed Authority, and the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf.
And of course, knowing how UNCLOS works in real life is important too.
Exactly. Cases like the Enrique Alexei incident and the South China Sea are great examples. Knowing the theory is good, but being able to analyze those real situations and connect them to UNCLOS is key.
So they need to show they can use their knowledge, not just memorize facts.
Precisely. And they should also be aware of the challenges facing UNCLOS, like climate change, resource scarcity, and those new technologies we discussed. Being able to critically analyze how NCLS might need to adapt is essential.
It sounds like the UPSC examiners want to see candidates who truly understand UNCLOS and its role in international relations.
That's right. They want you to be able to explain how important UNCLOS is for maintaining peace, security, and sustainable development in the oceans. It's about connecting the dots and showing a full understanding.
Now, as we move towards our final thoughts on UNCLOS, let's leave our listeners with something to think about. UNCLOS has shaped how we think about and govern the oceans for decades now.
But as we look into the future, a future shaped by climate change, resource scarcity, and rapid technological changes, one question stands out. How will NCLOS evolve?
Will it be able to adapt and stay relevant, or will it be left behind? That's the question we'll be exploring in our final segment. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. In this last part, we're looking ahead to see how NCLOS might need to change to handle the challenges of the future.
Right. We've seen how UNCLOS has been a force for stability and also a point of contention when it comes to the oceans. But with so many changes happening in the world, UNCLOS might need to adapt to stay effective.
We've already talked about climate change, resource scarcity, and new technologies. Let's start with climate change. How could rising sea levels specifically impact UNCLOS from a legal perspective?
One of the biggest impacts could be on those maritime boundaries we talked about. As sea levels rise, coastlines could shift, and that might lead to disputes over where maritime zones begin and end, especially the exclusive economic zone, which is so important for resources.
Right, because if the baseline that the EEZ is measured from changes, the whole zone could move, potentially overlapping with other countries' claims.
Exactly. And right now, UNCLOS doesn't really tell us how to deal with those situations. It brings up some complicated questions about how to redraw those boundaries fairly, while still respecting the rights of all the coastal states.
So we might need some new rules or additions to UNCLOS to deal with these climate-related boundary disputes. What about resource scarcity? How could UNCLOS be improved to manage those dwindling ocean resources when demand keeps going up?
One area that might need some attention is fisheries management. Overfishing is a big problem in many parts of the world. UNCLOS encourages sustainable fishing, but it could be made stronger to give countries more power to stop illegal fishing and enforce those quotas within their EEZs.
And what about deep-sea mining? We talked about the interest in getting minerals from the seabed, but also the environmental concerns. Could UNCLOS help regulate that industry as it grows?
It definitely could. UNCLOS already created the International Seabed Authority to manage those resources beyond national boundaries. But as deep-sea mining technology gets more advanced, the ISA might need more authority to make sure those activities are done sustainably and don't damage those fragile ecosystems down there.
So UNCLOS is a good starting point, but it might need some adjustments to keep up with the challenges of deep-sea mining. We also mentioned marine genetic resources, those valuable materials from marine organisms that could be useful for medicine and biotechnology. Is that another area where UNCLOS could play a bigger role?
Yes, that's becoming a more and more important issue in international law. The question is how to balance the potential benefits of these resources with the need to protect marine biodiversity and make sure everyone can access them. Some people think UNCLOS should be changed to specifically address marine genetic resources and create clear rules about how to use them, share the benefits, and make sure they're conserved.
So we might need to define who owns those resources, how they can be used, and how the benefits should be shared, especially in areas that aren't under any one country's control.
Right. Those are complicated issues, and finding solutions that work for everybody will take a lot of discussion and a real commitment to sustainable development.
We've talked about a lot of areas where UNCLOS might need to change, but one of the biggest challenges with any international treaty is making sure people follow the rules. How do we make sure UNCLOS isn't just words on paper, but rules that countries actually obey?
That's a critical question. It's not enough to have the rules you have to make sure countries actually do what they're supposed to.
So what are some ways to encourage countries to comply with UNCLOS?
One important tool is diplomacy and international pressure. When countries break the rules, other countries can talk to them and urge them to do the right thing. International organizations like the UN can also keep track of whether countries are following the rules and help them communicate with each other.
So it's about holding countries accountable for what they do.
Exactly. And there can also be economic incentives. For example, countries that follow UNCLOS and manage their fisheries sustainably might get better access to certain fishing areas or markets.
So there are rewards and also potential consequences. Are there other things to think about?
In extreme cases, if diplomacy and economic incentives don't work, the international community might consider sanctions against countries that keep breaking the rules, things like trade restrictions or limits on getting international loans.
So there should be real consequences. But it sounds like sanctions should only be used in the most serious situations.
Definitely. The goal is to encourage countries to work together and follow the rules, not to punish them. And the best way to do that is to make sure every country feels like they benefit from playing by the rules.
So we need a system that's fair and effective. It has to balance the interests of individual countries with the need to protect the oceans for everyone.
Precisely. And that's the ongoing challenge of international law and of UNCLOS specifically. Finding that balance between what different countries want and what's best for the oceans as a whole, both now and in the future.
That's a great point. I think that's a good place to end our deep dive into UNCLOS. We've covered a lot, from the basics of the treaty to the complex challenges it faces in a world that's changing so quickly.
We looked at the maritime zones, the institutions, and how UNCLOS works in real disputes. We also talked about how it might need to change to keep up with things like climate change, resource scarcity, and new technologies.
And we emphasized how important it is to make sure countries follow the rules and create a system that encourages compliance. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listeners have a better understanding of this important treaty and how it shapes the future of our oceans.
I hope so too. And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, stay curious, and join us again for our next deep dive. Thanks for listening.